The first phone call I ever made in a crisis was to my mother. The last phone call she ever needed to make in hers was to me. I think about that a lot now. The symmetry of it. How a life can fold back on itself that way. Clean and quiet. Like a letter you wrote 40 years ago that finally arrives at the right address, slightly wore at the edges but intact. Every word still legible. I did not expect to be the one it folded back toward. I am not the son who lives nearby. I am not the one who shows up for Sunday dinners or drops off groceries on a Wednesday afternoon or fixes a stuck drawer in the kitchen that has been stuck since 2019. That is supposed to be Kenneth's role. He lives 8 minutes from my mother's front door. I looked up the exact distance that night. I needed to understand the geography of what had happened. 8 minutes. The length of a coffee break. The length of a song on the radio. 8 minutes. My name is Gerald Sutton. I am 67 years old. I live in Hartford, Connecticut. In a house I bought with money, I earned over 31 years of municipal contract work, water treatment infrastructure, drainage systems, the kind of civil engineering that nobody photographs or writes about, but that keeps a city functioning quietly the way good habits keep a man functioning quietly. Nobody ever put my name on a building. I was fine with that. I drove to job sites in a 2011 Ford F-150 dark blue, and I wore work boots I resold twice before I replaced them, and I retired at 63 with a pension, a clear conscience, and 187,000 miles on that same truck, which I still drive and have no intention of replacing. It runs. I run. We understand each other. I live with my wife, Patricia, who has been married to me for 38 years and has the specific patience of a woman who chose a quiet man on purpose and has never once pretended to regret it. We have 2 adult children of our own, both settled, both good people. I grow tomatoes in the summer. I read on the back porch in the evenings. I make coffee at 8 o'clock every night, decaf, because I am 67 and I would like to sleep, and I sit at the kitchen table with whatever I am reading until around 10. And then I go to bed, and that is my life, and I am grateful for every ordinary inch of it. My mother's name is Dolores Sutton. She turned 82 in March, and she lives in Knoxville, Tennessee, in the same house she and my father bought in 1971 for $34,200, which was a significant sum for a young couple in that era, and which they treated accordingly. Maintained carefully, updated practically, never once considered selling. 3-bedroom, single-story, hardwood floors she has refinished twice. A dogwood tree in the front yard that blooms every April with what I can only describe as a sense of personal accomplishment, like it knows it has survived another winter and wants credit for it. My father, Raymond Sutton, passed 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, swift and ungenerous. He was gone in 4 months from diagnosis. Since then, my mother has lived alone in that house, and she has done so with a self-sufficiency that I have always admired and occasionally worried about in equal measure. She keeps the house spotless. She tends a small garden in the side yard. She makes biscuits from scratch on Sunday mornings and has opinions about the correct ratio of butter to flour that she will share with you whether you asked or not. She has a book club and a standing Tuesday lunch with 2 women she has known since 1979. She has never, in my entire memory, called anyone in a panic. She does not perform distress. She does not alarm people. She manages things. When she calls me at an unusual hour, I know before she speaks that something has already moved past the point where she can manage it herself. That is the single most important thing I can tell you about Dolores Sutton. When she calls, something is actually wrong. My brother's name is Kenneth Sutton. He is 64 years old, 3 years my junior, and he has lived in Knoxville his entire adult life. He is a regional sales manager for a commercial flooring company. He has a 4-bedroom house with a finished basement, a boat he takes out onto Norris Lake, maybe 4 times a year, and a reliable habit of describing himself as a family man at any gathering where that description might earn him something. A nod, a smile, an assumption of character he has not quite demonstrated, but which he wears comfortably, the way some men wear a good watch they didn't earn. He coached Little League for 6 seasons. He gives an excellent toast at Christmas. His 2 adult children adore him. I have never questioned any of that. A man can be genuinely warm to the people he chooses to be warm to while also being something else entirely to the people who need him most and inconvenience him at the wrong moment. I want you to have a complete picture of Kenneth before I tell you what he did. because what he did was not done by a villain. It was done by a man who had a habit, built over years, of making calculation, quietly, almost unconsciously, the way habits work, that his comfort had roughly the same value as other people's crises. He never said that out loud. He probably never thought it in those terms. But on a Tuesday night in November, when an 82-year-old woman called him and told him her chest had been feeling heavy for 4 hours, he came over, looked at her for a few minutes, and told her it was probably something she ate, and then he drove home. I need you to sit with that for a second. He drove home. I have described my evening routine already. The coffee, the kitchen table, the library book. On the night of November 14th, the book was a history of Roman aqueduct engineering, which is exactly the kind of thing I read, and which tells you something about the specific texture of my retirement. My coffee was 3/4 cold. It was 10:51 p.m. My phone lit up on the table beside the book. My mother's name was on the screen. I picked up before the second buzz. She said, "Gerald." One word. My name. The way she said it was a full sentence. Quiet, controlled, but with something underneath it that I have not heard in her voice very often in 67 years. The something underneath, it was effort. The effort of a woman who is working to sound calmer than she is. I said, "Mom, talk to me." She told me in measured sentences. The pressure had started around 6 in the evening. Not pain. She said she was careful about that word, which told me she had been parsing her own symptoms for hours. Try and be precise, so she wouldn't sound dramatic. A pressure, something sitting on her chest, on the sternum, that wouldn't shift when she moved or changed position. She had taken 2 aspirin at 7:30 and sat in her recliner and waited for it to ease. By 10 o'clock it had not eased, so she called Kenneth. He came. She told me that clearly she wanted me to know he came. He asked her some questions. He looked at her. He said he thought it was probably digestive, something she'd eaten at dinner. He said if it was still bothering her in the morning, she should call her regular doctor, Dr. Phyllis Garrett, who she has seen for 12 years. Then he said good night, and he drove back to his house, 8 minutes away, and she was alone again. She waited another 40 minutes after he left. Then she got her purse and her insurance card from the drawer in the kitchen where she keeps important documents, and she drove herself to the University of Tennessee Medical Center emergency room. Alone, at 82 years old, with chest pressure that had been sitting on her sternum for 4 hours. She drove herself. She was calling me from a plastic chair in the waiting room. Something in me went very still when she said that. I want to be accurate about what I felt, because accuracy matters to me, and I think it matters to you too. It was not anger, not in that first moment. Anger is hot and fast, and it closes things down. What I felt was colder than anger. It was a specific cold that comes when something you have half known for years becomes something you can no longer half know. A door that had been slightly open for a long time swung shut, cleanly, without drama. I felt it close. I said, "Mom, listen carefully. The next person in scrubs who walks anywhere near you, you stop them. You tell them you are 82 years old, you are alone, and you have had chest pressure for 4 hours. Those exact words. Don't soften it." She said, "I don't want to make a fuss." I said, "Dolores, I use her first name about 4 times a decade." She heard it. You are the patient. Making a fuss is the entire point of being there. You do it. A small pause. Then she said she would. I said I was on my way. She told me Hartford was too far, that I didn't need to do that it was late. I have known my mother for 67 years, and I have never once in my life been talked out of something by being told it was too far or too late. I said, "I will see you in 6 hours." I ended the call. I was packed and out the door in 19 minutes. Patricia was awake when I came into the bedroom. She had heard me moving through the house with a specific efficiency that she knows means something has shifted from ordinary to serious. I told her in 4 sentences. She said she was coming. I told her about her mother's hip follow-up appointment the next morning, the one she had rescheduled twice and couldn't reschedule again. She looked at me with the expression of a woman who hates that her husband is right. She said, "You call me the minute you get there." I said I would. She said, "Drive carefully, Gerald. I mean it." I said I would do that too. I was in the truck at 11:17 p.m., pulling out of the driveway into a cold November night, heading south on I-84. I want to tell you about that drive because it matters to me that you understand what 6 hours alone in a truck in the dark does to a man's thinking. The first hour I was just moving, just covering distance, the way you do when the animal part of you knows it needs to be somewhere, and the thinking part hasn't caught up yet. The Blue Ridge Mountains rose up out of the dark around Roanoke as a series of felt shapes against a sky that was slightly less dark than the land. No stars, overcast, just the shapes of things pressing up against the ceiling of the night. I noticed that. I noticed things like that. I have always been a man who notices a physical world when my interior world is processing something it can't quite name yet. I stopped at a truck stop outside Roanoke at 2:14 a.m. I bought a large coffee from a machine behind a sneeze guard. It was extremely bad coffee. I drank all of it in the parking lot, standing next to the F-150 in the cold, looking at the sky, thinking about Kenneth, not with anger, with the methodical attention I used to give to engineering problems, isolating variables, understanding load-bearing elements, identifying where the structural failure actually was and how long it had been there. The structural failure, I realized, had been there for a long time. I had simply not had cause to measure it until now. My mother called at 1:06 a.m. to tell me they had taken her back from the waiting room. I had already been driving for 2 hours. She sounded calmer. The movement had helped. Having something happen, being in a room where things were being done, had settled her in the way that action always settles a practical person. She called again at 2:44 a.m. A cardiologist named Dr. Raymond Chu had come in. He had ordered an EKG and a troponin panel. Troponin is a protein released by heart muscle when it is under stress, a marker that tells doctors whether the heart has been strained. She told me this with the same careful precision with which she had described her symptoms, because she had asked Dr. Chu to explain what he was doing and why, and he had done so, and she had listened. She said he was young and very calm and spoke to her like she was an intelligent adult, which he said with particular quiet satisfaction, that told me Dr. Chu had earned himself a loyal patient. She said he had told her she did the right thing coming in. I said, "You did." She was quiet a moment. Then she said, "Kenneth told me it was something I ate." I said, "I know, Mom." She said, "He's not a bad person, Gerald." I said, "Get some rest. I'll be there by 6. I pulled into the hospital parking structure at 5:52 a.m. I sat in the truck for 90 seconds before I got out. I needed those 90 seconds. I used them to set aside everything that was not about walking into that building and finding my mother. The rest, Kenneth, the will, the weeks to come, that was all still there, patient and cold, waiting for its moment. I set aside. I got out of the truck. Room 4C was on the cardiac observation unit, 4th floor. I found it without asking. I had looked up the hospital layout on my phone somewhere around the Tennessee state line, because that is how I am built, and I was not going to arrive after a 6-hour drive and waste 10 minutes asking for directions. The door was open. The room was quiet. The monitor above the bed showed numbers I could read, because I had also looked up normal reference ranges for cardiac monitoring in elderly women somewhere around Abingdon, Virginia. She was asleep, propped slightly on the adjustable bed, a pulse oximeter on her right index finger, a blood pressure cuff loosely attached to her upper arm. She was wearing a hospital gown, and she had her hair pinned back the way she pins it when she means business, which made me feel unexpectedly and inconveniently like I might need to stand very still for a moment. I stood very still for a moment. Then I sat down in the blue vinyl chair next to her bed, and I opened the folder I had brought from home. My mother's complete medical history, insurance cards, medication list, current prescriptions with dosages, the name and contact information for Dr. Phyllis Garrett, and the name and contact number for her estate attorney, a man named Donald Price, who had drafted her in my father's will in 2009 and whom I had a feeling I would be calling. I put the folder on my knee, and I reviewed it in the gray-blue light of that hospital room while my mother slept. Patience is not the absence of feeling. I want to be clear about that. Patience is the decision about what you do with feeling once you've had it. I had the feeling. I felt it fully. Sitting in that chair, watching my mother's chest rise and fall with the steady indifference of a body that was going to keep doing what it does regardless of what anyone thinks about it. I felt it for 11 seconds. I counted. Then I turned to the medication page of the folder, and I began reading. My mother woke at 7:20 a.m. She turned her head and saw me in the chair, and her face did something I did not expect. It didn't show surprise. It showed recognition, as if some part of her, even in sleep, had known I was there and had been waiting for her eyes to confirm it. She said, "You drove all night." I said, "Traffic was light." She has always appreciated a dry delivery. She smiled at that, a small, real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes. Then she looked at the folder on my knee and she said, "You brought the folder." I said, "I always have the folder, Mom." She said, "I know. That's what I mean." Dr. Raymond Chu arrived at 8:15 a.m. He was 35, maybe 38. It is difficult to tell with confident people, because competence ages a young face and certainty doesn't. He had dark hair, a calm, measured way of moving through the room, and he shook my hand before he did anything else, which I noted. He confirmed my relationship to my mother, asked if I was her medical proxy. I was. She had named me when my father passed, and then he sat down on the rolling stool near the bed and spoke to us both as if we were equals in the conversation, which we were. The troponin had peaked overnight and was trending downward. Good sign. The EKG showed changes consistent with a mild cardiac stress event, not a myocardial infarction. He was clear about that, but a warning. The heart had been under strain. The stress test, scheduled for 11 o'clock, would tell him more about her baseline cardiac function and help him determine the appropriate ongoing care plan. He said she was fortunate she had come in when she did. He said that clearly, without elaboration, and looked at her when he said it. I said, "She waited 4 hours before she came in." He looked at me. He did not ask why. He said, "I understand." 2 words. He left shortly after. My mother and I sat in the quiet of the room, the monitor beeping at its steady interval, the hallway sounds of hospital morning drifting under the door. She said, "Don't be too hard on your brother." I said, "Let's focus on you right now." She said, "Gerald." I said, "Mom, I drove all night. Let me have this morning." She accepted that. She folded her hands on the blanket and looked at the window and accepted it, which meant she understood that I had made a decision, and that the shape of that decision was already visible to her, because she has been reading me for 67 years, and there is nothing about me she doesn't recognize. The stress test at 11 o'clock took 40 minutes. I waited in a chair in the corridor outside the cardiology suite, with a cup of hospital coffee that was marginally better than the truck stop variety, and I used that time to make 2 phone calls. The first was to Patricia. I told her my mother was stable, that the test was in progress, that I would call again when we had results. Patricia said, "How are you doing, Gerald?" I said I was fine. She said, "I know what fine means when you say it like that." I said, "I'll call you when we know more." She said, "Okay, I love you." I said, "I love you too." Then I ended the call and sat with the coffee. The second call was to Robert Calloway. Robert has been my attorney for 22 years. He is 61, lean and quiet, with a background in estate law that he spent 15 years practicing before he moved into general practice. And he has the personality of a man who approaches every problem the way a good file clerk approaches a disorganized cabinet, methodically, without drama, with a genuine interest in getting things into the right order. I have referred him 3 clients over the years. He has sent me no referrals, because I do not generate legal work very often. I like him for that reason. He does not manufacture need. He waits for it to exist, and then he addresses it. I reach him on his cell at 11:34 a.m. I gave him the facts in sequence: my mother's age, her current health situation, the general structure of her estate as I understood it, the house, the CDs, the life insurance, the brokerage account my father had left her, and the fact that her existing will had last been reviewed in 2009, when my father was still alive, and had not been updated in the 11 years since his death. I told him what had happened on the night of November 14th. I told him that I was in Knoxville, and that my mother was stable, and that I believed a conversation about her affairs was both appropriate and overdue. Robert listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for approximately 5 seconds. Then he said, "Does she want to have this conversation?" I said, "I haven't asked her yet. I want to know if you could come before I asked." He said, "I can be in Knoxville Thursday morning. Early if that helps." I said, 10 o'clock. He said, 10 o'clock. "One question, Gerald. Is this her idea or yours?" I said, "It will be hers by the time you get there." He said, "Good. That's the only way it works." Dr. Chu came to my mother's room at 1:15 p.m. with the stress test results. He sat on the rolling stool again. He said her cardiac function showed mild diastolic dysfunction. The heart's ability to relax between beats was mildly reduced, which is common in women her age and is manageable with the right medication protocol and regular monitoring. He said it was not a condition that needed to limit her life in any significant way. He said the word manageable twice, deliberately, because he understood that what an 82-year-old woman needs to hear in a hospital room is not a catalog of limitations, but a map of what is still possible. He said he would provide a referral to a cardiologist in Knoxville for ongoing care, and that the follow-up plan he was recommending was straightforward. My mother asked him 3 questions. They were good questions, specific, practical, about medication interactions and activity restrictions, and what symptoms should prompt her to call someone immediately rather than waiting. Dr. Chu answered each one completely. When she was done, he said, "You are very well informed about your own health, Mrs. Sutton." She said, "I try to be." He nodded and left. After he was gone, I pulled my chair closer to the bed. I said, "Mom, I want to ask you something, and I want you to know before I ask it that whatever you decide is the right decision." She looked at me with the patient attention of a woman who has been making her own decisions for 82 years and does not need to be told that she will continue to do so. I said, "When did you last look at your will?" She said, "When your father died." I said, "Do you think it still reflects what you want?" She was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the window. The afternoon light was coming in at a low angle, the particular flat gold of November afternoon in Tennessee, and it caught the edge of the blanket and the side of her face, and she looked, in that light, like a woman who was doing something she had perhaps been waiting to do for a while. "Thinking a thing through to its conclusion," she said. "No, I don't think it does." I said, "My attorney is coming Thursday morning. He's an estate man. He'll explain things clearly, and he won't push you toward anything. He just asks questions and writes down the answers." She said, "What time Thursday?" I said, 10 o'clock. She said, "I'll make coffee." I said, "He'd appreciate that." She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, "Gerald, I know why you called him." I said, "I know you know." She said, "I want to be the one who decides." I said, "That's the only way I'd want it." She nodded once. That was the end of the conversation. She picked up the television remote and turned on the local news, and we watched it together in that room for an hour, and she commented on a weather forecast, and I told her the forecaster looked nervous, and she said probably because he was wrong half the time, and it was the most normal 20 minutes I had spent in a long time. It was exactly what I needed. My mother was discharged Thursday morning at 9 o'clock. I had stayed in the guest room of her house. The same room, same yellow curtains from 1984, same slight creak in the floorboards near the closet that I have navigated barefoot since I was 22. I drove her home in the F-150. She inspected the truck the way she always does, with the expression she reserves for things she considers willfully impractical. She said, "Gerald, this truck has more miles on it than some marriages." I said, "It's reliable." She said, "So was your father's hip before it wasn't." I did not have a response for that. I rarely do. Robert Calloway arrived at 10:08 a.m. in a gray Volvo, clean and sensible. I made introductions. My mother shook his hand and looked at him with the direct evaluating attention she gives to anyone who enters her house for the first time, which is the same look she has given contractors, doctors, and my children's various friends over the decades, and which is not unfriendly, but is absolutely honest. Robert met it without flinching. He said, "Mrs. Sutton, I work for you in this room. My job is to listen and write down exactly what you say. Nothing else." She said, "Good. Sit down. There's coffee." I sat to the side. I had told Robert the first would be present but not participatory, and I held to that. This was her kitchen table, her house, her 53 years of a life she had built carefully with my father and then alone, and it was not my place to do anything in that room except be present in case she needed me, which she did not. Robert worked through her estate systematically. He asked about each asset in turn. The house, assessed at $287,000 by the county the previous year. 2 certificates of deposit at First Tennessee Bank totaling $118,400. A whole life insurance policy she held since 1981, with a death benefit of $75,000, and the brokerage account my father had established in 1994, currently valued at $43,700. He asked what she wanted to happen to each of those things. She told him. She was clear and unhurried and specific. She knew what she wanted. She had known, I suspected, for longer than that Thursday morning. I will not tell you what she decided. That is her business. What I will tell you is that when Robert read back his notes, she made 2 small corrections. A single word change in one instruction, a specific account number she had memorized and wanted included explicitly, and that after he made those corrections and read them back a second time, she said, "That's right. That's what I want." And Robert said, "Then that's what we'll say." After Robert left, my mother and I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet of her house, the November light coming to the window over the sink, the old clock on the wall marking the seconds the way it has marked them for 40 years. She made another pot of coffee. I drank it even though I didn't need it, because sometimes the ritual matters more than the need. She said, "Kenneth called this morning, before you were up." I said, "What did he say?" She said he had told her he was sorry, that he'd been thinking about that night, and he should have taken it more seriously, that he should have stayed with her or driven her in himself. She said he had sounded genuinely sorry. She said this carefully, the way she says things she wants me to hear accurately rather than through the filter of what I already think. I said, "What did you say?" She said, "I told him I appreciated the call." I said, "Good." She looked at me over her coffee cup. She said, "He called 3 days after. Not that night. Not the next morning." I said, "I know." She said, "I noticed that." I said, "I know you noticed." She set down her cup. She said, "I don't want this to end your relationship with your brother." I said, "It won't." She said, "I mean it, Gerald." I said, "So do I. Kenneth and I are fine. We'll always be fine. This isn't about Kenneth and me." She looked at me steadily. She said, "What is it about, then?" I said, "It's about making sure that if your chest feels heavy at 6 in the evening and it hasn't moved by 10 o'clock, there is something in writing that reflects the choices you actually want. Not the ones from 2009, the ones from today." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's a careful way of saying it." I said, "I'm a careful man." She almost smiled at that. Almost. Kenneth called me on a Friday evening 9 days after my mother's discharge. I was home in Hartford, back at my kitchen table, different book, same cold coffee, the specific comfort of a routine reasserting itself. It was 6:43 p.m. when his name appeared on my phone. He said, "Gerald." I wanted to reach out. I said, "I'm listening." He said he knew I had driven down. He said he knew I had been there when he couldn't be. He said he wanted me to know he appreciated it. I said, "You could have been there, Kenneth." He was quiet for a moment, a particular quiet, not the quiet of a man who has nothing to say, but the quiet of a man deciding which version of what he wants to say is safest. He said, "I genuinely thought she was okay." I looked at her and she seemed okay. I thought it was minor. I said, "She told you her chest had felt heavy for 4 hours. She is 82 years old. She called you because she didn't want to alarm anyone, and that is exactly who she is, which is exactly why when she calls you need to stay." He said, "I know that now." I said, "I think you knew it then." Another quiet, longer this time. He said, "So where does that leave us?" I said, "You and I are fine. I mean that genuinely. You're my brother, and that doesn't change." He said, "But..." I said, "There's no but. Things are just going to be different going forward with Mom. I'm going to be more involved. Her affairs are in better order now than they were. She has a new cardiologist starting in December, and I'll be looped into that. I'll be down more often. He said, "Gerald, I'm right there. I can do that." I said, "I know where you are." I said it quietly, without heat, the way you say something when it is simply true and does not need decoration. He heard it. I know he heard it, because the quality of his silence changed. It acquired a texture it hadn't had before, the texture of a man who has just felt the ground shift slightly under him and is deciding whether to acknowledge it. He said, "Is there something you want to say to me directly?" I said, "I just said it." He said, "Okay." I said, "Give my love to Brenda. We'll talk soon." And I ended the call. I sat at the table. The coffee was cold. I made a fresh pot I didn't drink. Robert's draft documents arrived 12 days after the Knoxville meeting. My mother reviewed them with him by phone on a Tuesday afternoon. She called me that evening at 5:47 p.m. She said, "It says what I want to say." I said, "Good." She said, "I want you to understand something, Gerald. I didn't do this because of what happened with Kenneth. I did it because it was overdue. Because your father has been gone 11 years, and I should have looked at this 6 years ago. This is my decision. The hospital just reminded me it was time." I said, "I know that, Mom." She said, "I want to say it out loud so it's clear." I said, "It's clear." She said, "Good." A pause. Robert explains things plainly. I appreciated that. I said, "I thought you would." She signed the documents on a Thursday morning at the kitchen table she had sat at for 53 years, notarized by a woman named Ellen Marsh from a mobile notary service that Robert had arranged. 2 witnesses. Her neighbor of 24 years, Mrs. Patricia Odom, 79 years old and sharp as a tack, who brought a tin of ginger snaps to the occasion because she brings ginger snaps to every occasion of significance, which I found correct. The second witness was her book club friend Beverly Greer, who arrived 7 minutes late and apologized 3 times, which my mother accepted with the gracious patience of a woman who has been accepting late arrivals from Beverly Greer since 1987. Robert called me at 2:17 p.m. He said, "Documents are executed and filed. Everything is in order." I said, "Thank you, Robert." He said, "She's a sharp woman, your mother." I said, "She always has been." I was sitting in the parking lot of a hardware store in Hartford when he called. I had driven there to buy a replacement handle for a garden spade. I sat in the truck after the call ended, with the engine running and the heat on against the December cold, and I let myself feel what I felt. I counted 12 seconds this time, maybe 13. Then I went inside and bought the handle. It has been 4 months. My mother had her first appointment with Dr. Susan Marlar, the cardiologist Robert's Knoxville contact recommended, in early December. Dr. Marlar is 53, with a particular quality of attention that makes you feel like yours is the only chart on her desk, which I understand is a cultivated skill and a genuine gift in equal measure. She has my mother on a low-dose beta blocker and a quarterly monitoring schedule, and my mother calls her hard homework, with an inflection that suggests she finds it slightly beneath her, but is doing it anyway, which is exactly right. I call on Sunday afternoons, as I always have. I also call Tuesday evenings now. 7 o'clock. She expects it. I can hear in the way she picks up a specific settled quality in her voice, like a woman sitting down in a chair she knows is going to hold her. Kenneth and I have spoken 4 times since November. The conversations are what they have always been, surface warm, occasionally funny. The easy rhythm of 2 men who grew up in the same house and carry the same references and will never be strangers to each other. What is different is something below the surface, something that both of us know is there and neither of us is named, and perhaps neither of us needs to name. Some reckonings don't require a speech. They just require that both parties understand clearly and permanently what was demonstrated on a particular night, and what that demonstration means for everything that follows. The will says what my mother wants it to say. I know what it says. Kenneth does not. That is how it will remain, because it is not my information to share. My mother handled her affairs on her own terms, with clear eyes, in her own kitchen, at the table where she has made every significant decision of her adult life. I was there to make sure she had the space and the support to do it. That is the entirety of my role, and I am at peace with it. A man drives 6 hours through the dark because someone who needs him is alone. He sits in a blue vinyl chair at 6 in the morning with a folder on his knee, because that is what preparation looks like, and preparation is the only thing that holds when everything else becomes uncertain. He makes a phone call to the right attorney at the right moment because he has spent 67 years learning to recognize when a moment requires action rather than patience, and when it requires patience rather than action, and how rarely those two things look the way you expect them to. Some inheritances are measured in dollars. Some are measured in who shows up at 6 in the morning in a blue vinyl chair, having driven through the dark. My mother knew the difference. She has always known. There is something I have thought about in the months since that night that I want to leave you with, about the people in your life who manage things quietly, who do not call at midnight, unless something has already moved past the point where they can handle it alone. Those people, the managers, the self-sufficient ones, the ones who fold their own fear into a smaller shape, so they won't inconvenience anyone. Those are the people who need you to pay attention most. Not because they'll ask. They won't. They never do. Because that is exactly who they are, and exactly why when they finally make the call, you go. You get in the truck. You don't ask how far. You just go.